Hello and welcome to World War II Part 21, a day that will live in infamy. By the dawn of December 7th, relations between the United States and Japanese and negotiations had gone sour. The Japanese weeks before, had already decided to, go to war. From early November, they decided to go to war in the Pacific to achieve their aims. What I'll bring you first, actually, is a bit of a conversation that was held in a Japanese cabinet meeting. This cabinet meeting was on November 1st, and it included many Japanese signatories from military and diplomatic affairs. So Togo, Foreign Affairs Minister, stated it's unlikely the Germans will succeed in effecting a landing in England even with our assistance, and in any case we should not delude ourselves about the contribution that collaboration between Germany and Italy can make to our cause. Now Sugiyama replied, "We need the help of no one to achieve our objectives in our campaign in the south. Once that is over, China will be isolated and will capitulate. Next spring we shall turn our attention to the Soviet Union." So the initial Japanese plan that many of them had was to get rid of China and then by spring 1942 target Eastern Soviet Union, which the Russians wouldn't have been happy about. Now Kaya, finance minister, said, "We have confidence in a war lasting 2 years but not beyond that." Tojo replied, "Anyway, that gives us 2 years. Togo, why take such a risk? The Western powers won't attack us. They have enough on their plate with the war in Europe. It is to our advantage to maintain peace." Nagano replied, "After 2 years of war, we shall have made all the conquered territories in south impregnable. We shall not fear America, however strong then she is." Now Kaya replied, "Defense is not the way to victory. When and how will victory come?" Nagano stated, "Now at once, we shall never have a chance like this again." Sugiyama, "The first half of December is the right time to start active operations. We can temporise no longer with only a month to go. Let us break off diplomatic negotiations now and prepare unequivocally for war." Now, Sukada, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, said the decision to go to war should be taken at once. Togo replied, 2,600 years of Japanese history cannot be dismissed so glibly. Sukada states the army must have an immediate decision. Now Ito, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Japanese Navy, stated, "The Navy will be ready by November 20th. Why not continue negotiations till then?" Obviously not wanting to alert the Americans as to their immediate intentions. Now Sakada stated, "The army cannot wait longer than November 13th. After that date, the government may be overturned. I propose that as from November 13th, military action takes priority over diplomatic action." Then Shimada of the Japanese Navy stated, "Why not continue negotiating to within 24 hours of launching an attack?" Now the debate concluded with decision to let the military chiefs take command at situation at midnight on November 30th. Now nevertheless, Togo had gained an ultimatum respite of 4 weeks with which he hoped to get new agreement by United States for new compromise proposals that were submitted by Ambassador Kurusa, who was married to an American who was thought to have a better chance of being listened to in Washington. But basically, none of these diplomatic moves actually came to fruition, and the Japanese military were now in charge of the situation and were resolved on an attack. So the Japanese Navy, was a very powerful modern navy. They had powerful, large, modern aircraft carriers with large plane complements. They also had a very advanced air force, including fantastic fighter aircraft, torpedo bombers and regular bombers, and Japan also had a very large and modern navy. Now at the time of the outbreak of war, the Japanese Navy consisted of 11 aircraft carriers, one of the most powerful aircraft carrier forces in the world. They also had 10 battleships. Japan also had a fleet of 18 cruisers, which were heavy, 23 light cruisers. They had 129 destroyers, 67 submarines, and 13 gunboats. So the Japanese had a large advanced navy. They also had just over 50 divisions, counting all types. They had just over 50 divisions. Now the thing about that is 27 of them were currently serving in the war in China and 13 were guarding the Mongolian frontier. So that left nearly 500,000 men that Japan had to play with in the South Pacific, and other areas. So they still had considerable forces with which to target the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Malaysia, and other areas which they wished to attack. And when the Japanese declaration of war came, a little bit too late, as I'll go into in a minute, the Japanese were already prepared. I highlighted on last video how, Japanese ships carrying troops were headed for Malaysia, days and days and days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Japan stayed quiet, got everything set up. Now itself, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, now the initial plan was that the Japanese would notify the Americans of their declaration of war. But sadly, a delay happened, and therefore the Japanese ambassador was delayed in delivering his declaration of war. And sadly for the Japanese, that declaration of war via official notification came after the attack on Pearl Harbor had begun and was pretty much, nearing its end. So basically the Americans were absolutely incensed by this. The Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor and then issue a declaration of war rather than declaring war, and thus giving the American fleet chance to be put on alert. It was seen as a sneaky move, a snide move, and in fact it was just a delay. It was delayed typing up the diplomatic message properly, but sadly Pearl Harbor was being ransacked by Japanese bombs at this time, and when that declaration of war was given, it did not go down well. President Roosevelt coined it as a day that will live in infamy, and one senior American military stated, by the time we're through with them, the Japanese language will only be spoken in hell. So basically, another key figure, in the attack on Pearl Harbor was Admiral Yamamoto, the famous Japanese naval officer. Now, Admiral Yamamoto had tried to warn his colleagues, because he had travelled widely in America, He'd seen a lot of America, he'd seen a lot of the entire way of life and system there. And Admiral Yamamoto was one who pressed that the Pearl Harbor attack must take out the carriers, that the American aircraft carriers were absolutely vital targets to take out, because as Admiral Yamamoto tried to warn the Japanese military staff, I have travelled widely in America, we will be unbeatable for 6 months, but then if their vast industrial might fully comes to fruition, so to speak, we will have no more victories. Basically, Admiral Yamamoto were trying to warn the Japanese that if they are going to war with America, they must win quickly, surgically, and deal America a blow that they may not threaten Japan for a year or two, because as Admiral Yamamoto knew, once the wave of indignation swept America, and the American government, military and public were absolutely incensed and immediately wanting to go to war, that America's vast industrial might would immediately go to a war footing, at which time Admiral Yamamoto knew that even though Japan may have success for 6 months, eventually they would be overpowered and drowned by the just massive American industrial might. So the American aircraft carriers were one of the main targets. They wanted to deal a crippling blow to the American fleet, but they also wanted to get the carriers. Now, as luck would have it, the American carriers were sent on manoeuvres a short time before the Pearl Harbor attack happened, and thus were not there. If the American carriers had been at Pearl Harbor and had been taken out and sunk, it would have been a huge blow to the Americans. It would not have knocked them out of the war, because America had more than those carriers there, but it would have been a huge hammer blow, and it would have been longer before America could directly interfere with any Japanese movements in the Pacific. But the attack was brutal, the attack was brutal when it came in. And also, from what I remember, I mentioned Haplotype Zero in comment, that I read years ago that American radar operators at Pearl Harbor were told that they were expecting a flight of seaplanes, coming in on this certain vector, and thus when they saw the blips on the radar, not to get overly worried, because they were expecting a flight of seaplanes. Sadly, for Pearl Harbor and for the American radar operators, the Japanese planes came in directly on that angle. They came in directly on that flight path that the American seaplanes were apparently coming from. So the attack was all set, Japan. Now, When we look at the forces, okay, given for the attack on Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral Nagumo, okay, his task force, whose mission was to attack and destroy the American carriers at Pearl Harbor and launch a crippling blow to the American fleet, had included in his fleet 6 aircraft carriers. They were the Kaga, the Akagi, the Hiryu, the Soryu, the Zuikaku, and the Shokaku, okay, and they had a complement of 432 combat aircraft, fighters, torpedo bombers, the whole works. He also had the Kirishima and Hiei, okay, which were modern advanced battleships. He also had 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. The Japanese also brought with them a number of tankers so they could refuel their ships at sea, so they didn't have to put in a port where they could be spotted. So basically, once the Japanese fleet went to sea, they moved very stealthily, avoided any merchantman lanes and any fairly used shipping lanes, and they approached Pearl Harbor from stealth until they were within range to launch their first attack on Pearl Harbor. And the attack came, and it was devastating. So, okay, Pearl Harbor at 6 a.m., okay, 6 a.m. on the morning of December 7th, okay, Pearl Harbor went crazy as 183 Japanese aircraft, after taking off from the carriers, approached Pearl Harbor. Now, these included 49 high-level bombers that would bomb and carpet bomb and strafe the American base, airfields, and military installations. They had 51 dive bombers and 40 torpedo aircraft, escorted by 43 of the outstanding and one of the famed fighter aircraft of the war, and one of the best fighter aircraft of the war, very respected and revered, the Mitsubishi Zero, which was, like the Bf-109 and the P-51, one of the great fighter aircraft of World War II. So basically, the torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and high-level bombers escorted by the Zeros, 183, took off to approach Pearl Harbor to begin their attack, and their attack came fast and suddenly, okay. Now, the attack takes the Americans completely by surprise. Now, as it happens, the 2 aircraft carriers, okay, I previously mentioned, the Lexington and the Enterprise, are at sea, okay. They have escorts of 3 heavy cruisers and 9 destroyers. The first is at Midway, and the second is on the way to Wake Island, of course. Midway would be also, like Stalingrad, a pivotal battle in World War II. Now, at 7:48 a.m., okay, Captain Mitsui Fushida, commanding the first wave, gives the signal over the radio, the famous signal, to, 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 a Japanese expression meaning fight. Then soon after, he signals Tora, 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 the great battle cry of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Tora, Tora, Tora means tiger, 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 which informs his squadrons that they have succeeded in surprising the enemy. There are still 96 American vessels in Pearl Harbor. You see, if the Americans knew of the approaching Japanese aircraft, they would have started moving those ships out had they had time to split their fleet up. But sadly, the battleships were caught on what they call battleship row. The ships were docked and they were completely taken by surprise. Now, at 7:55 a.m., okay, the whole of the seaplane base is wrecked by bombs dropped from the dive bombers. Okay, soon afterwards, the first big ship is hit. It is the destroyer Monaghan. At 8 a.m., okay, coming in like lightning, torpedo aircraft hit and seriously damaged the target ship Utah, the cruisers Raleigh and Helena, and the mine layer Oglala. Okay, next to the battleships Arizona and Nevada, then the Oklahoma and West Virginia. The battleship California is also hit by 2 torpedoes. At last, Admiral Kimmel issues the order to attack, emphasizing with involuntary irony, "This is not an exercise." Hickman Airfield is destroyed. All the aircraft on it are also shattered and smashed. Drawn up in smart lines along edges of runway are just set alight and bombed and burned. 2 minutes later, the same fate strikes the Army Airfield at Wheeler Field, and after that, the base at Iwo, okay, the airbase, where 33 out of the 49 aircraft at that airbase are destroyed. Now, at 8:40 a.m., okay, the second wave, which took off from carriers at 7:15 a.m., arrives at Hawaii. 134 bombers escorted by 36 Zero fighters. At 8:54 a.m., okay, the aircraft attack. This time, the American anti-aircraft defences are not taken by surprise, and the coordinated fire inflicts some losses on the attackers, though without preventing them carrying out their mission. Okay, at 9:06 a.m., the Japanese now attack the basin where the flagship, the battleship Pennsylvania, is moored with the destroyers Cassin and Downs. Now, gigantic explosions shake the three vessels. The destroyer Shaw in dry dock is also struck. Fuel and ammunition stores explode and burn on every side. This attack is brutal and quick. 9:45 a.m. aircraft at second wave return to their ships. Now, Naval Squadron, okay, gives up the search for the two American carriers and sails for home at 1:30 p.m. Captain Fushida argues that his aircraft can recontour the sea towards the south west in the search of the carriers and their escort. But Admiral Nagumo, okay, does not want to run risk of missing the rendezvous with refueling tankers, which are on the northern route. He would probably have been able to carry out the total mission assigned to him, the annihilation of American fleet, but he's content with remarkable results the Japanese already achieved. The Japanese squadron reaches home with no enemy intervention and anchors in Hashijima roadstead on December 23rd. Now, at 2:26 p.m., first reports of attack reach America itself. The losses are severe. Okay, now just looking at this a bit more, you know, it really was a tragic attack. I mean, ultimately, the near 191st wave ships went in. It was literally apocalypse ensuing. Okay, the information. Like I said, 1 hour the formation appeared on training radar, but this information would have been given 30 minutes warning to Pacific Fleet, were not reported, okay, because of the coincidence that, like I mentioned, a formation of flying fortresses coming from California was expected at the same time from the same direction. What are the chances that a group of American planes at the precise time on the precise vector would be expected to approach Pearl Harbor just at the same time and vector the Japanese planes are coming from? Okay. Now, Lieutenant Commander Nakaya, he was leading fighters at first wave. He actually stated later, Pearl Harbor was still asleep in the morning mist. It was calm and serene inside the harbor, not even a trace of smoke from the ships at Oahu. The orderly group of barracks, the wriggling white line of the automobile road, climbing up the mountaintop, fine objectives of attacking all directions. In line with these inside harbor were important ships at Pacific Fleet, strung out and anchored, two ships side by side in an orderly manner. Now, basically, after Admiral Bellinger gave the order, this is no drill, okay? This is when the battleships really came under attack. The Japanese concentrated mainly on the 7 battleships moored in pairs along Ford Island, which stands in middle at roadstead. Now, one 1,760-pound bomb blew up the forward magazine of the Arizona, while another dropped down the funnel and exploded in the engine room. So, one bomb blew the ammunition area, and another dropped down a funnel of the ship and blew up in engine room. I mean, devastation was complete. The ship settled quickly and went down with Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and 1,106 officers, petty officers, and other ranks out of a crew of 1,511. So only just under 400 men survived. Now, struck by 3 torpedoes, the Oklahoma capsized almost instantaneously, trapping below decks 415 men, some of whom survived until Christmas Eve. Had it not been for extraordinary presence of mind at cruising, taking action to right at 2 ships, West Virginia and California would have met the same fate. The Nevada was hit by a torpedo and 2 bombs, but shot down 3 of her attacking aircraft. Maryland and Tennessee escaped relatively light and were able after December 20th to leave Oahu for an American dockyard, together with the Pennsylvania, which had been in dry dock and thus out of reach of torpedoes. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers also suffered damage. Now, the Japanese pilot Nuzo Mori gives the following account of his feelings as he flew his torpedo plane in an attack on an American battleship. I manoeuvred in order to make my line of approach absolutely right, knowing that the depth of water in the harbour was rarely more than 35 feet. The slightest error in speed or altitude when firing might upset the mechanism at torpedo and make it go to the bottom or break surface, undoing all my efforts either way. At that time I was hardly aware of my actions. I acted like an automaton through force of habit which my long training had given me. The battleship appeared to leap suddenly into view across the front of my machine, looming huge like a vast grey mountain. Stand by, fire. All the while I completely forgot the enemy fire and the throbbing of my own engine, totally absorbed by my manoeuvre. At the right moment I pulled with all my strength on release lever. The machine jolted violently as shells hit the wings and fuselage. My head was flung back and I felt as if I'd just been hit by an iron bar. But I'd made it. The torpedo launching was perfect. My plane still flew and responded to my control. The torpedo was going to score a direct hit. I suddenly became conscious of where I was and the intensity of the enemy fire. Also in the second wave, launched by Nagumo, Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki, had completed the first wave in the harbour. It turned its attention to several naval installations on Ford Island, Wheeler and Hickam airfields, the Air Force bases, and the flying boat station at Kanoe, destroying 65 aircraft out of 231 there. In men, America had lost 2,403 killed and lost 1,178 wounded. It also, like he demonstrated, left certain American soldiers trapped in ships that had partially capsized, who had to be rescued or died later. Now, tremendous success of the attack on Pearl Harbor cost Nagumo only 29 planes and 55 airmen. Now, after recovering aircraft at second strike, Nagumo set course north at 1300 hours. The midget submarine attack, however, was a complete failure. However, on December 10th, one of the transport submarines was sent at bottom by aircraft from the carrier Enterprise. Moreover, the Japanese admitted to attack the vast oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, whose destruction, would have incapacitated the US fleet for months. If Japan would have gone for the oil storage tank areas and destroyed them, the American fleet would have been effectively crippled for a long time and would have not been able to really match the Japanese in any way. So that was a major military blunder. American soldiers and sailors had reacted so swiftly to re-establish the situation that Nagumo abandoned a third assault, as the Americans were now putting up spirited and aggressive resistance, as he thought, that in the cost of aircraft would be prohibitive, conclusive enough proof that Kimmel had shown energy and intelligence in training his crews. Now, Yamamoto, if one could forgive him for an analogy from boxing, had flattered himself that it would knock the US Navy out in the first round. In fact, he had merely left it groggy, but the US Navy was still upright. The destruction of 2 battleships, the damage sustained by 6 others, did not deprive it of its main striking power, its aircraft carriers. They were all intact and within a fleet of 20 cruisers and 65 destroyers. And above all, the attack on December 7th mobilized all American resources and raised a mighty wave of indignation across the United States, which was steadily mounting and would grow into colossal force and strength of conviction. So the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, and sadly, the US described it as a day of shame because of treacherous nature of Japanese attack. But in fact, the Japanese government, like I said, had sent the declaration of war to its representative in Washington, and it ought to have been handed to Americans at the exact moment that would still allow the Japanese to take the American defences by surprise, but would not lay them open to the charge of violating the first article of the Hague Convention of 1907. But there was a delay in the transcription of message, so that it was only handed over while the attack was still actually in progress. Incredible, really. The attack on Pearl Harbor has happened and the damage to the American fleet has been vast, but the American carriers were not there. The all-vital carriers were not there. Their all-vital oil reserves were left intact and were not attacked in place. Now, basically what happens, after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have also been absolutely making moves everywhere else. Preparing, sending troops, sending ships, sending air forces, basically to begin their secondary offensives, and the Japanese went over to the attack almost everywhere at once. Now, on December 2nd, 1941, 2 great British ships with an escort of 4 destroyers arrived at Singapore, the so-called Arsenal of Democracy, or Gibraltar of the East. Force Z should also have included an aircraft carrier to give air cover, but she'd gone aground in shallow waters in Britain, and Churchill would brook no delay in view of immense political importance of having a strong naval squadron in the Far East. This is 5 days before Pearl Harbor. So in command at Squadron is Admiral Tom Spencer Vaughan Phillips, an energetic and capable officer, popular with his men who call him Tom Thumb on the account of his short stature, although it was much the same as Nelson's. Now, Phillips' force, his battle force comprised the latest battleship, the Prince of Wales, which came in at 35,000 tons and had 10 14-inch guns, the battleship Repulse, which came in at 32,000 tons, and 4 destroyers, the Electra, the Express, the Tenedos, and the Vampire. And at last, the Great Port, equipped with a dry dock big enough to take the biggest ships in the world, has a fleet, but aircraft are short. Only 362 British aircraft for the whole of the Far East. 141 of them were in Malaya. They were mostly Buffalo fighters, which were no match for the fantastic Japanese Zero. There are 22 airfields, but 15 of them are on grass and difficult to use in frequent tropical rains. They become entire mud piles. The land forces consisted of 88,000 men, which included British, Australian, Indian and Malayan, and the island of Singapore was strongly fortified towards the sea where any attack was expected to come from. But completely undefended on the landward side, which was the way the Japanese planned to approach it. So the Japanese realised that basically the defences were far too strong at Singapore, so the Japanese planned to attack it from its weak side on land. So the huge guns, 5 15-inch guns, 6 9-inch guns and 14 6-inch guns never got to fire a shot. The defences of the port of Singapore never got to fire a shot. All the heavy guns, because the Japanese attacked from land from the opposite direction. So on December 8th, at 5:35 p.m, Phillips sails with his squadron to meet the Japanese who were carrying out landings in north of the Malayan Peninsula. Now, instead, of observing strategic principle with fleet intact, a principle dear to Churchill, the Admiral wants to join battle with the enemy. Now, east of Singapore, but unaware of the British presence, 2 big Japanese warships, the Kongo and the Haruma, are approaching with an escort of submarines under the command of Admiral Kondo. Now, on December 9th at 2 p.m, as described already, one of Admiral Kondo's submarine sights force said, and instantly informs the flagship, giving the position wrongly. At 5:30 p.m, thinking they've been spotted by Japanese aircraft, which actually are giving air cover to Kongo and Haruma, and have seen nothing, and so concluding that it would be impossible to take the enemy landing force by surprise, the British go about and sail for Singapore. What a tragic decision that is. They could have arrived in middle at Japanese landing and caused absolute mayhem. Now, at 8:15 p.m. at dusk, a formation of Japanese aircraft takes off from the Saigon airport and searches for the British ships for 6 hours, but they cannot find them. They've turned around about and gone the other way, and because of wrong bearings given by the submarine prior. So on December 10th, as light breaks, another Japanese submarine sights force said, and this time the precise position of enemy is signalled to the Japanese admiral. Now, Phillips has received a message to the effect that the Japanese will be attacking the harbour and airfield at Kuantan on the east coast of the Malayan Peninsula. So he decides to take the enemy by surprise. He arrives off Kuantan at 8 a.m. on December 10th, but there is no sign of Japanese. Now, one of his destroyers, the Express, enters the port and carries out an inspection, but there's nothing there either. So the British are getting confused. What is going on? Where are the Japanese? Now, the squadron sets a course for Singapore, maintaining radio silence as to not attract the attention of the Japanese if they are nearby, or especially the Japanese submarines. There's no danger of air attack, the Admiral says, since the nearest enemy airbase is over 400 miles away, though in any case, on account of radio silence, he cannot send a message to Singapore anyway to ask for air cover, because if he does, the Japanese could pinpoint the position and attack. The Japanese, however, on receipt a new signal, have sent up several squadrons of bombers and torpedo aircraft, and at 11 a.m. on December 10th, the British ships are located and the first attack comes at 11:20. The Repulse is hit but not severely. At 11:40, the torpedo carrying aircraft arrived. By skillful manoeuvre, the Repulse manages to dodge 19 torpedoes. The Repulse has 19 torpedoes fired at it by the Japanese torpedo bombers, but they managed to dodge all of them. Great steering there. But the Prince of Wales is hit twice, once on stern and once on the port side. Now, the first torpedo on the Prince of Wales damages the screws and the steering gear, bringing the ship to a halt so that it becomes an easy target. Now, while the Repulse approaches the bigger ship, she's attacked by a second formation of torpedo aircraft and is hit by at least 5 torpedoes. She sinks inside of 6 minutes at 12:33 p.m. 513 men go down with her. So the Repulse, which managed to evade 19 torpedoes, was trying to get to the Prince of Wales to assist, and was hit by a whole volley of at least 5 torpedoes and sank with 6 minutes, taking down 513 men with her, of the men who couldn't get off the ship in time. Now, meanwhile, Prince of Wales has been hit by 3 torpedoes. He's out of control, is ablaze from incendiary bombs, and sinks at 1:20 p.m, causing deaths of 327 men, including the dauntless Tom Thumb, Admiral Phillips. The destroyers pick up 1,285 survivors. But this simple attack here, okay, has targeted the 2 big battleships of Force Z, okay, the Far East British Fleet, the Repulse and the Prince of Wales. Now, initially, the Prince of Wales crippled, the Repulse dodged assault torpedoes, but then going to help the Prince of Wales, the Repulse is struck by multiple torpedoes, sinks, taking down over 500 crew, and then the Prince of Wales, a stationary target. So basically, even though 1,285 survivors are later picked up by the British destroyers and support ships, 2 battleships have gone down within a space of 40 minutes, and taking with them nearly 1,000 British naval lives. I mean, it is a fantastic victory for the Japanese. The Japanese have only lost 4 aircraft, and in return of that, they have taken down 2 British battleships, 2 modern British battleships. So, following virtual elimination of American fleet at Pearl Harbor amongst the big ships and the putting out of action of a number of other battleships have now sank 2 large British Caterpillar ships in this action. It gives the Japanese absolute mastery at Far Eastern sea areas and a greater part of Pacific. Within 3 days, within 3 days of hostilities opening, they've struck Pearl Harbor. The Japanese have also struck and won a great victory over British naval force at Malaya. So the Japanese rising sun is certainly on the rise. Incredible, really. Now, at 4:15 a.m. in Malaya, 17 Japanese bombers also dropped bombs on Singapore. Now, the city is still fully lit, as in peacetime. There are 61 dead and 133 wounded. But Japanese bombers flying over Singapore, all the lights turned on, just allowed them to plan the targets even better. So nearly 200 casualties there, largely among Chinese population. At 5:35 p.m., on December 8th, that's when Admiral Phillips sails, with the intention of engaging the Japanese landing at Malaya, the proposed landing. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, Japanese commanded by General Masaharu Homma launched their operations against this great archipelago, which lies along future supply line for petrol, which they wish to obtain from the Dutch East Indies. Now, the main air base for the attack on the Philippines is Formosa, now Taiwan, where the Japanese pilots are specially trained to fly with greatest possible economy of fuel, since they have to cover such a great distance to reach the Philippines. Now, to defend the islands at Philippines, there are only 160 aircraft. 35 of them are B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, quite useless for defensive purposes. At 12:55 p.m. on December 8th, the Japanese made their first air attack on Luzon, the principal island of the archipelago. The Americans are caught unprepared and lose 86 aircraft against just 7 Japanese Zero fighters shot down. Now, besides Luzon, attacks are also made on the port of Davao in Mindanao Island, causing considerable damage. The next day, operations are held up by a storm. The Japanese, though, do occupy the island of Bataan between Luzon and Formosa without opposition. Now, the American Asian Fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Glassford, leaves Iloy in the Philippines in direction of the Makassar Straits in the Dutch East Indies. Now, the crew at US gunboat Wake, stranded in the port of Shanghai, fail in an attempt scuttling and surrendering to Japanese. In the end, the Japanese capture the American garrisons of Shanghai and Tientsin, and the aircraft bomb Hong Kong, Guam, and Wake. The Japanese have gone to all-out war. Pearl Harbor was the first attack of many planned coordinated attacks in many different territories. The attack on Pearl Harbor is where World War II became truly a global war. Even though it could be characterized as a global war in some ways, it was mainly a European and North African theatre-wide war. But with the mass breakout of war between Japan, Britain, France, America, everyone else, it truly becomes a global war. So, Japanese landings in Malaya on December 9th at Kota Baru and Singoria, and also at Patani in Thailand. Now, Thai resistance to Japanese ceases very quickly, and Japan is allowed to occupy the capital, Bangkok. So also in the Pacific, okay, I'll close out by doing some more Pacific now, and then I'll just detail what will happen when I get to 1942. So in Pacific on December 10th, okay, Japanese units also land on island of Guam and occupy it within hours. Now in Philippines, the Japanese land at dawn on the northern tip of Luzon near Apari and Gonzaga, and on the island of Camiguin, okay. American resistance is vigorous, but they are just outskilled and overpowered at the moment. Powerful Japanese air attack on the port installations at Cavite. One American destroyer, 2 submarines and a minesweeper are damaged. 2 Japanese minesweepers and a submarine are also sunk, and also it's on this day that the Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft. So the Japanese attacks have come in very quick and have achieved incredible success already. And you know, the Japanese are far from done. Now in the Far East, okay, in China, the American garrison in Peking is taken prisoner by the Japanese. And the Japanese begin their operations against the British colony of Hong Kong, which comprises the island of the same name and the so-called New Territories on the Chinese mainland. Now a violent air and artillery bombardment forces the 11,300 Scottish, Canadian and Indian troops in the garrison to withdraw from mainland and onto the island, leaving large amounts of arms and ammunition in enemy hands. Meanwhile, at Wake Island, a Japanese squadron commanded by Admiral Kajioka, based on the Marshall Islands and made up of the light cruiser Yabari, 6 destroyers and 2 patrol boats and 2 troop transports, arrives off Wake Island with the intention of taking it. Now, the Americans do not open fire or send up their aircraft until the invasion force is less than 3 miles off the coast. So the Americans wait until the Japanese are literally a few miles away before sending up their aircraft. A good decision. 2 Japanese destroyers, the Hayate and the Kisagari, are sunk, and Admiral Kajioka orders the force to withdraw. So that little delay in launching the combat aircraft allowed the Americans to turn back the proposed invasion of Wake Island. Now after this, Japan always precede their invasion operations by heavy air raids. So the Japanese learn from this and think, right, well, next time we're going to take an island, we'll bomb the hell out of it first. In the Philippines, okay, 3,000 soldiers land at Apari in the north of Luzon, joining up with all those already landed. Other contingents land southeast of the city of Manila at Legazpi. So basically, the Japanese are basically going to war everywhere. America in this time also declares war on Italy and Germany. Now on 12th of December, Japanese aircraft batter Hong Kong, the Philippine airfields, and particularly Subic Bay west of Manila. In Malaya, they have carried out an average of 120 bombing missions every day since the beginning of the invasion. The airfield at Butterworth in the northeast at Peninsula has to be evacuated. At Georgetown in Penang, the raids claimed 600 dead and 1,100 wounded. The few British aircraft left were Dutch aircraft that have come to the Allies' help, were withdrawn southwards to defend the airfields, the harbour at Singapore and the Malayan capital Kuala Lumpur. Now, French ships anchored at US ports are now requisitioned, okay, by the American authorities. The Americans are no longer playing nice at all. They are still furious over Pearl Harbor and are determined to gain revenge on the Japanese. Now, in Borneo, a detachment of Indian troops destroys the oil installations in Sarawak and Brunei, then retires to Kuching, okay, capital of Sarawak, to defend the local airport. In Burma, the British evacuate Victoria Point on the Thai border in the southern part of the country, on the isthmus, retreating north to the area of Tenerife, okay. In Hawaii, an American squadron commanded by Rear Admiral Fletcher sails from Pearl Harbor to bring Wake to Pearl Island. At that point, I will stop here, okay? I will stop here now. Basically, okay, that is the end of part 21. What I just want to do for the last few minutes is explain what will happen. Now we have so many theatres of war going on. You know, I do not want to get confusing by in one part going through multiple theatres of war because people can't follow it. So, in the last 2 minutes, I'll just explain what will happen now. We are virtually at the end of 1941, okay? And as people know on Eastern Front, I've covered up to the Thaw in March 1941. So how my episodes of World War II will work now. Starting from 1942, I will do a series of parts covering the 1942, the Pacific Theatre, okay? I will then go back and do a series of parts covering 1942, covering the Russian attack at Kharkov, the doomed attack at Kharkov, Case Blue, leading to the end of the year. Okay, I will then do parts going through the Eastern Front and then do parts going through North Africa and other territories. So I will split the parts up. So coming next, we will go to the Eastern Front. Okay, I may do one more part to close out 1941, then and to cover better Operation Crusader. But then, okay, in 1942, we'll go to the Eastern Front, do 2 or 3 parts, however long that takes, then jump back and do the Pacific Theatre parts for 1942, then go back and do Africa, etc. That's how I'm going to structure it. So when you see the next episode, it will be World War II Part 22. It will be 1942, say, Eastern Front Part 1. And then the next one will be Eastern Front Part 2, then Eastern Front Part 3. Then it'll go to World War II, 1942, Pacific Part 1, Pacific Part 2, etc. That's how I'm going to do it. So if people are wanting to follow more the Eastern Front, it's easier to identify where I'm talking about the Eastern Front, rather than having the Eastern Front mixed in with the Pacific, mixed in with Operation Crusader. So that's how I'm going to do it. Thank you for joining me on World War II Part 21, a day that will live in infamy. America is indignant, angry and determined to get revenge. The Japanese, meanwhile, have launched an absolute blitz of multiple territories and have had incredible success, and we shall see how they go from here in further parts. That is the end of part 21 of World War II. I'm out for now.